I am Melissa Fuller, and I was part of the Friends of Tamarack Lake group, which was a group of concerned citizens that worked to help get the lake restored. And we're here for a meeting today to learn more about the introduction to aquatic plants, because Tamarack Lake is going to start being filled, and we need to learn more information about what we can do to keep it a clean and safe lake.
All right, so some familiar faces in the crowd. Go ahead and get started. My name is Brian Pilarczyk. I'm the watershed specialist for the Crawford County Conservation District. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about aquatic plants. And aquatic plants get, they usually don't get a whole lot of attention unless they're wrapped around your prop, or you're tangled up in them when you're trying to fish, or if you can't get your kayak out. But a lot of folks don't really pay a whole lot of attention to what the plants are and whether they're good plants, bad plants, indifferent, and what they mean. So this is a little bit of a primer on some of the aquatic plants that we have in Northwest Pennsylvania, invasive ones as well as native ones, and then also just a little bit about why they're important and why we should care about them there. All right, there's really 4 basic types of aquatic plants in our lakes and reservoirs. And they can be broken down into emergent plants, floating plants, submerged plants, and then algae as well. Right, and those plants can be broken up somewhat into zones. And if you look and if you think of a lakeshore, and you think about it going from a upland area down into the lake, and then beyond that, we have zones that we look into. We're going to skip the first couple of zones where you have uplands and wetlands, and really look at the emergent vegetation, the vegetation that your feet are wet when you're walking around in it, the floating and submerged vegetation, and then once you get into the open water, that's where we start getting into the algae. So I threw this slide in here kind of last minute, so it doesn't roll really well, but just to give you a little bit of a idea of an area that doesn't look very healthy, an area that's suffering from erosion, and an area that at least has a little bit of a buffer with aquatic plants, or with those emergent plants that are rolling into it, just to give you something to think about whether healthy or not. So I'm going to start off with those 4 types of aquatic plants. Emergent plants, these are the ones where you're knee-deep in water, up to waist deep. They grow in shallow water margins. They're really great wildlife and food and cover. They're also nesting areas for waterfowl and also shorebirds. They provide for pollutant filtration. So as pollutants are rolling off of the landscape, they're taking up sediment and holding it in place. They're also turning a lot of the nutrients that can cause problems. So fertilizers, phosphorus, and nitrogen, they can turn those nutrients into standing biomass, or the plant material themselves. And then also shoreline stabilization. These aquatic plants, these emergent plants, they break up wave action as the waves are coming in against the shoreline, and they slow down that wave action. Their roots also help to hold in place the shoreline and help to stabilize it. So they're really good for shoreline stabilization. And what I'm going to do throughout the presentation is, as I go into each one of these groups, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the plants that are pretty common in this area, and whether or not they're native or not, and then some of the attributes of them. This is one that, if you're out during the summer, these tend to bloom a good portion of the summer. Hickory weed is an emergent plant that most of our lakes and reservoirs in this area and our marshes have hickory weed on their margins. It's a really pretty purple flower. Again, this is a great habitat for shorebirds. It's also good refuge for small and juvenile fish. Spatterdock, cow lily, yellow bullhead lily. This one's got a whole bunch of names. There's a couple different varieties that we have here. This is one particular variety. But spatterdock is a really common species as well. If you're out and somebody's generically calling something lily pads, it's probably one of a couple different things, and this is probably one of them. Most of our wetlands in this area, most of our lakes and reservoirs have spatterdock. They end up getting this kind of compact yellow flower that sticks up off of the stem. The other kind of interesting thing about them is if you look at the bottom left corner and you see the root structure, those long tubular root structures that are in between them in throughout the plant colonies. This is one of our invasive species, and this is one that's gaining a foothold in Crawford County and northwest Pennsylvania in general. Purple loosestrife, and this is one that you'll find both in those wet margin areas alongside of the lakes and reservoirs, as well as up into the upland areas. They tend to colonize wetland areas. Purple loosestrife, which looks really pretty. It looks pretty similar to that pickerel weed until you get an idea that this stuff is about this tall. The pickerel weed is only about that tall. Purple loosestrife, one of the biggest problems with it is that it tends to create monocultures of just purple loosestrife, meaning that when purple loosestrife gets into an area, eventually all you have is purple loosestrife. It's poor food, it's not real great cover, and those monocultures end up being a really pretty sea of purple, but they don't really provide anything else beyond that. So this was a plant that was brought over for gardening that escaped, and now we're really starting to see this take off around Aquatic Lake. It's become a problem. Sugar Lake, it's become a problem in other areas around the county. So this is one to be aware of. And if you haven't noticed on the back table, I do have a bunch of pamphlets and whatnot. So there are identification guides for each one of these that you'll be able to see. American Lotus. This is one that at this point we only have it on Pine Tuning Reservoir in Crawford County. It's also Lake Wilhelm. American Lotus has an interesting story. It's native to the southern United States, and it's kind of got a strange natural history in the northeast United States. Some states listed as an invasive, some states listed as a native, some are indifferent to its status, and some listed as locally endangered species. Pennsylvania had listed it as a state endangered species, and it's either been delisted or is just about to be delisted and classified as an invasive plant. American Lotus, it's really pretty. If you have seen flower arrangements with that seed pod structure in the bottom, then you recognize what that looks like. If you've been around Pine Tuning, you find those all over the shoreline. They do provide food for wildlife, so they do have some value. In the springtime, they are good crappie cover, but in the summertime, they end up as a dead zone in the lake. So oxygen levels plummet underneath them. Last check on Pine Tuning, there was about 300 to 400 acres of Pine Tuning Reservoir that was under American Lotus at this point, and it is expanding. So it's one of those species that you don't want to show up. Looks pretty, looks nice, but it has a lot of negative effects as well. All right, if we move into to floating plants, floating plants are sometimes rooted with long stems that are buoyant and flexible, that move with the water level, moving up and down. The stems are, like I said, they're flexible to move with the water changes. They do provide really good overhead cover. Generally, they'll form in colonies, and you'll have areas of floating plants and then areas without them. And the smallest versions of these are watermeal and duckweed. Watermeal and duckweed are the smallest flowering vascular plants in the world. So these are the smallest plants in the world with a flowering structure. It's kind of rare to find the flowering structure, but they do flower. Watermeal, if you put your hand through it and run it through your fingers, it feels just like kind of like cornmeal. Duckweed is a little bit larger leaves on the other side of the slide there, usually with little root structure that hangs out throughout the bottom. It's good food source for waterfowl. The problem is that even though some of these species that I'm bringing up, even if they are native, they can cause problems in some cases. A lot of times pond owners will find problems with watermeal and duckweed because it tends to reproduce really quickly. And when it reproduces quickly, it can completely cover the surface of the water body and can reduce oxygen levels too low for fish to survive. So there can be negative consequences with these. In a natural environment, they're normally don't cause problems. Where you usually see problems are in really nutrient-rich ponds that are isolated. Waterfowl can take these from pond to pond and deposit them, and one day you don't have them. A couple days later, all of a sudden your pond is covered with duckweed. So it's one to keep an eye on, but has an important place within a natural environment. So fragrant white water lily, this is another one that if you're in and around lakes and reservoirs in northwest Pennsylvania, you've definitely seen this plant. It's different from the spatterdock that I showed you earlier. Spatterdock, the leaves are up and off the surface of the water on a stem. These have that floating leaf that has the flexible stem that moves up and down with the water level. The leaves are round on these. They kind of have a Pac-Man shape to them. Another one that looks similar, but is a lot smaller, is another native that we have here. This is called water shield, dollar bonnet. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see like a gelatinous film that's over the bottom of the leaves. That's a sure way to tell whether or not you have water shield or not. So if you reach down and you grab hold of this plant, it comes up slimy. So they think that that's a layer to prevent algae from attaching and other things within the waterway. But this is a native species that we have here. One that looks just like it, but is a problem species, is European Frogbit. European Frogbit was identified in Mercer County just a couple of years ago in Lake Wilhelm, and then on the adjacent game lands that are in Lake Wilhelm. It looks similar to water shield. It's got a little bit different leaf structure. It's more of a roundish, almost heart-shaped leaf structure. The problem with Frogbit is that it reproduces really quickly, and that's a general theme with these invasive species. They don't have natural controls, so they reproduce really fast, and they tend to completely cover waterways. And again, when you completely cover a waterway with vegetation, you're reducing the amount of oxygen that's getting into that waterway. It's really difficult to control these species once they get in place. And at this point, like I said, it's only in Mercer County, but this is another one that we're keeping an eye out for in Crawford. European water chestnut, again in Mercer County, this showed up last year. The first documented report in Mercer County. It's gaining traction in southeast Pennsylvania, and it's also in Warren County. It's moving down from New York State. If you notice the students that are in the lower picture, they're not happy about that. I think they're just excited to get their picture taken. But if you look at the coverage on that waterway in southeast Pennsylvania, my counterparts that are working with European water chestnut, that's what they're describing. So once it gets established, it's really quick at reproducing. Once it reproduces, it sets seeds, like you see in the upper right-hand corner of the frame. Those seeds have a really needle-sharp edges on them, 2 or 3 of those needle-sharp edges. Makes it really tough to walk barefoot in an area of European water chestnut. The good news about this one is that if you catch it quickly, it's easy to hand remove. Where a lot of these species are not easy to remove by hand, they reproduce by fragmentation. This is one that does not reproduce by fragmentation. And if you can find isolated plants like this, remove them and destroy them, you effectively remove the infestation. If you leave it go, you're likely to have your lake looking like the one on the bottom. Again, that's in Mercer County and Warren County, so it's not that far out of our area. And yellow floating heart, this is a new one for me, showed up last year in Crawford County, right outside of Woodcock Creek Lake. It's an interesting backstory on this. The landowner had caught me at a pond workshop. He said, I've got this yellow plant that's in my pond. I can't figure out what it is. It's scaring me how quickly it's reproducing. It's pretty much covered my pond. Can you come out and take a look at it? So I came out, took a look at it, realized what it was, yellow floating heart. And the backstory on it was that he had purchased it for a water garden, and it was an isolated small contained water garden that it hadn't caused any problems. He liked it, it was pretty, he put it in the pond, and when he put it in the pond, it took right off. It's kind of scary that these things are still for sale in Pennsylvania. This is on one of the Great Lakes least wanted list. It's one of the species that is of the most concern. It's really difficult to control. It's difficult to really get a handle on it. The other thing is the seed structures. When it produces seed, they're floating seeds they kind of have a hairy outside coating. It's really easy to connect to waterfowl and then be dispersed around the area. So the lucky thing was the landowner. There was a small pond. He knew he had made a mistake. He just needed a little bit of help on figuring out how to control it. So he's took it on himself to control that. But this is a species that it's the first time it showed up in northwest Pennsylvania, and it was kind of scary how quickly it took off. So hopefully we've got that contained. If you look at the upper left-hand corner and look at the leaf, and look at the wavy structure around the leaf, and then also the flowers have kind of a fringed edge around the edges of the flowers, so it's pretty distinctive. The cautionary tale here is just because something's for sale and you see it listed in a water gardening catalog doesn't mean that it's safe. Make sure that you check to find out whether or not the species that you're looking at putting in your water garden is invasive or not. There's a lot of invasive species that are sold openly on the market, and there's no real clear way for you to know, so it's sort of buyer beware. So submerged plants, we get into what folks like to call seaweed. So they're often rooted with buoyant stems. They'll grow in the lighted zone, usually of the water body. So depending on how clear your water is, that usually will dictate how far out that you do have weeds. They're really great fish habitat and refuge. Again, a food source for wildlife. And they also work to take up nutrients, just like the emergent plants that we talked about. So this is the first one I was going to go over. A lot of these aquatic plants have multiple common names. This one goes by wild celery, tape grass, eelgrass. The interesting thing about this plant is that its reproductive strategy. So how it pollinates. And if you see those curlicue stems that are coming up in the water, that's the female plant structure. So it puts out this female plant structure on those curlicue, almost spring-like stems, keeps a little bit of tension on it, so it actually has a little indentation in the water. The male flowers or flower parts will float up to the surface, they're released, and because there's that little bit of surface tension and that little divot in the water, the male flower will pop in there and they pollinate, and they produce seeds. So it's kind of an interesting, when you see these out on the water. If you can't tell, I like aquatic plants. I think they're interesting when I look at them. So eelgrass, if you're a waterfowl hunter, these are great waterfowl food, especially for diving ducks. You'll get rafts of diving ducks over top of eelgrass beds. Normally, when you see an eelgrass bed, it's usually a pretty dense bed of eelgrass. It's pretty common on Conneaut Lake. One thing with our native plant species, like I said, a lot of them will get as much of a bad rap as some of the invasive species if they cause use impairments. And this is one that some of the folks don't like on Conneaut Lake. It's really actually a good sign on Conneaut Lake. This is one that's displaced some of the Eurasian water milfoil that was on the lake with the concerted efforts that they've had going on in Conneaut Lake to try to treat the invasive plants. This is a native that's come back and should be a much more welcome plant than the invasives that were there. Coontail. Coontail is another native plant. This one's really common. I always say if you ever picked up a raccoon by the tail, then you know what coontail feels like. If you can imagine a bristly, kind of a bristly tail, it's almost identical. It feels kind of coarse when you pick them up. A lot of these aquatic plants, when you pick them up, they sort of just flop over in your hand. There's not much substance to them. Or this one actually has a little bit of substance that you can feel. It's a little bit grittier. They are not rooted. A lot of times they'll anchor or be free floating. So you have these mats of coontail that float throughout the water body. Common bladderwort. This is a plant that you usually find in in really nutrient-poor systems, so bogs and wetlands and things of that nature. A little bit of interesting natural history is this picture that's right here is a close-up of one of the bladders. If you look at it, it looks like a turkey baster that you squeezed, getting ready to suck up some of the juice. The little hairs that are on the outside of it, when a small aquatic organism gets too close to one of those bladders, it trips those hairs and it actually sucks in the water, just like that turkey baster that I described. It does that so fast that photography has just got to the point that they can capture that happening. So it's an instant reaction, sucks in that aquatic organism, and then they're carnivorous plants. So they actually use that to remove phosphorus from the aquatic organism and then consume that. So it's another native species that we have here. Largely pondweed or broadleaf pondweed. This is one if you bass fish or musky fish, you'll hear people calling it cabbage. This is a native species. If you're looking for aquatic plants that are great fish habitat, this is one that fits the bill. Large leaves, large broad structure, a lot of structure for fish to get in and around. Pondweeds as a whole in Pennsylvania, it's the most numerous plant species that we have, aquatic plant species. There are 30 different pondweeds or potamogetons in Pennsylvania. Only one of them is invasive. So chances are if you find a pondweed, it's probably not the invasive type. I'll show you the invasive here in a second. A lot of the pondweeds have multiple types of leaves on their stems. They're polymorphic. So the top leaves are the submerged leaves. Those ones that are on the bottom are the floating leaves. So they're a lot more leathery, a little bit different shape. So you'll see different leaf structures on the plant. And then if you see those kind of stems sticking up, those are actually the flower structures that are coming off the plants. Really good cover, really good food source for wildlife. Pondweeds are really great for aquatic habitats. Curly leaf pondweed happens to be the one invasive that I mentioned. So this is one that's been around for a long time in Pennsylvania. Where it causes problems, it causes significant problems, but it has been around for quite a while. The distinctive feature on curly leaf pondweed are the narrow leaves, only about that wide, and the way I describe them, they're like lasagna noodles. So shaped a lot like lasagna noodles. So this is our only invasive pondweed in Pennsylvania. Eurasian water milfoil, up until a couple of years ago, this was one of the really bad actors in Pennsylvania. It still is one of the really bad actors. If you have an invasive in your lake or your reservoir, there's a good chance that this is the one that's causing the problems. They have these kind of feathery leaf structures that go out in four leaves off of the stem. There are a couple of native milfoils, but it's pretty rare to find those or encounter those. Most likely, if you encounter something like this, it's Eurasian water milfoil. If you're annoyed when you're fishing with weeds, there's a good chance that this is the one that's annoying you when you're out fishing. So this is an invasive. It's an invasive that's fairly easy to treat, but there's so much of it around that it's difficult to get ahead of it. This is one also that maybe Tim or Brian could verify this, but I think this was one that was usually a problem on Tamarack in the past. This was one of the bad actors that was on there, at least from
before the kabamba.
Before the kabamba.
Yeah.
All right, which leads me into, it's almost like we planned that too. So kabamba is another one, Carolina fanwort. This is one that's starting to cause problems on Conneaut Lake. So Eurasian water milfoil was the bad actor on Conneaut Lake. It still is to some extent, but this is one that's moving in and kind of taking that role. This is a really aggressive plant. It's one that's native to the southern United States. It was popular in the aquarium trade, and I think it still is popular in the aquarium trade. Again, buyer beware. So if you buy aquatic plants, the rule of thumb is don't release them into the environment, because once you do, they end up propagating and then taking off. Give you a backstory on Crystal Lake. If you fish Crystal Lake, Crystal Lake had a really good weed structure back in the early 2000s, really diverse native weed structure. Kabamba is really taking over the Crystal Lake and that series of Hartstown Marsh. So almost to the point that in some areas it's the dominant plant. And there's nothing else besides Fanwort in some of the areas. Riddle naiad. This is another one of our invasives. This one's pretty distinctive with these kind of umbrella-shaped leaves with the spikes that are coming off them. This one tends to be a problem on pine tuning reservoir in some areas. Again, like with a lot of the other invasive species that I talked about, invasive aquatic plants creates that monoculture that where you only find this species in such densities that there's no other room for anything else. So once you get into a dense bed of something like riddle naiad, it's different from those pond weeds that I described. The pond weeds have a lot of space in between them. They've got a lot of structure to be able to get in and around. When you get into a dense bed of riddle naiad, it's nothing but a dense bed of riddle naiad. There's no space in between them. It's almost like a pillow effect with that species. This is another native that we have. This is Eldia or waterweed. It's a pretty common species, another waterfowl food species. The reason that I bring this one up is to kind of imprint Eldia, because the next one I'm going to show is one that's a lookalike for Eldia that is a real problem species. So if you look at the leaf structure, what these look like, almost like lost my train of thought. But look at the three leaves around the central stem. Remember, three leaves are on the central stem as we move into the next slide. And this is Hydrilla. And this is one that we've been dealing with on pine tuning reservoir since around 2010 when it was first identified. Hydrilla is considered the almost perfect invasive plant. Hydrilla is really aggressive. It grows really quickly, and it's really difficult to control. And once you get a dense mat of Hydrilla, there is nothing else that's within it. It's basically think of shag carpet that you can almost walk across within Hydrilla. It's a federally noxious weed, meaning that the only thing, you can't do anything with Hydrilla. You can't move it, you can't collect it. The only thing you can do with Hydrilla is kill it. It's the only thing you're allowed to do with it. So I'll spend a little bit more time on Hydrilla. This is a picture from Florida. They've been dealing with Hydrilla in Florida since the 1950s. In Pennsylvania, it's been since the 1990s, somewhere in there, that they first identified Hydrilla in Pennsylvania. Hydrilla grows incredibly dense. If you look at the topped out Hydrilla that's in this picture, it's a good representation of what happens when Hydrilla gets a foothold within a waterway. Hydrilla is really dense. There's hardly any space for fish within it. You often hear fishing communities talk about Hydrilla as a great habitat. Initially, what happens with Hydrilla is you have a dense bed like this and almost a solid wall where it ends. That solid wall is where all the fish bunch up against and within, and the game fish just run up and down it looking for a meal. It's a short-lived situation because eventually what you end up with, especially a lake like Tamarack that has a maximum depth of 13 feet, the entire reservoir would look like that if it got a foothold. So that's the difference between the weeds that you have encountered in Tamarack and what Tamarack could look like with a species like this. What makes Hydrilla particularly difficult to control is these structures here. These structures are called tubers. These tubers, they're 6 to 8 inches within the substrate, maybe even deeper at some points. Those tubers are difficult to control with chemical controls, and you have to use different techniques than you would with other species. The kicker with these as well is that if you try to remove the top of the plant, say with mechanical means or with a chemical treatment that just removes the tops, they keep resprouting. And they'll resprout and resprout and resprout until the energy is depleted out of those tubers, which could be thousands and thousands of times resprouting that plant. The old adage was that Hydrilla can grow an inch a day. It's really much worse than that. Hydrilla grows a lot quicker than that and fills in areas. And just to give you an idea of the spread, within Pymatuning Reservoir, we've been sampling Hydrilla within Pymatuning since 2015. I said it was identified in 2010. 2015, we had about 11% of our sample points were positive for Hydrilla. That raised up to about 30% in 2016. Again, went up to 37% in 2017, so it was expanding pretty quickly. We finally got a treatment program in place that was able to treat a portion of the Hydrilla in Pymatuning. We're able to stall it pretty close to that 37%, but it's really pricey. It's really expensive to try to treat it, and the difference between the treated areas versus the untreated areas was night and day. So the treated areas, we got decent control on the Hydrilla. The untreated areas expanded quite a bit over the year without treatment. The big thing that happened in 2018 was that the causeway, the center portion of the reservoir, we were hoping that Hydrilla was going to stay south of the causeway because we didn't want it to end up in the north end. It jumped the causeway. Well, it didn't jump the causeway. It probably ended up underneath it on a boat or something else. And we did find points north of the causeway. The bad news with that is worst case estimate on Pymatuning Reservoir is that approximately 6,500 acres of the reservoir is susceptible to Hydrilla infestation out of 17,000 acres. So that's about a third of the reservoir that is susceptible to Hydrilla infestation, and particularly the north end of the reservoir in Sanctuary Lake is susceptible to Hydrilla more so than the southern end. So it's a real concern to try to get this under control. This should be a cautionary tale of what can happen if you don't get on an infestation quick enough. This is a threat to the tourism at Pymatuning. Nobody wants to have their boat sitting in what you saw in the slide earlier. It's going to have a detrimental effect if we can't get it under control. All right, we'll roll into algae. This is the last group that I'm going to talk about. It's the base of the food chain. There's many different types. There's filamentous and benthic algae types. Planktonic, which is free floating. There's green, blue-green, diatoms, macroalga. All right, planktonic algae, you can break it into a couple different groups. The diatoms and the green algae, which are in the two corners of the slide. These are really the base of the food chain. These are the things that the smaller fish are eating, the bigger fish are eating those. So this is what's building our food chains. The one in the middle is a blue-green algae. I'll talk a little bit more about those. Also, the one up at the top edge. It's more of a bacteria, cyanobacteria than a true plant. But that's the one that you see show up in the news causing problems. So there's multiple different types of algae. Not all algae is good. Not all algae is bad. It depends on what you have and the relationship of how much algae is within a waterway. Oftentimes phosphorus, and I think I mentioned this in my last talk, was that phosphorus drives algae production. The more phosphorus that you have from runoff, whether it's attached to soil or whether it's from fertilizers that were put in residential or agricultural areas, that phosphorus, once it ends up in a waterway, ends up being consumed by the algae and causing algal blooms. The more phosphorus you add, you can get to a tipping point where you change over from the good algae that we like to see, the diatoms and the green algae, over to a blue-green algae community that can be toxic. And if you were paying attention in the news, in 2014, you would have remembered that the city of Toledo had to shut down their water treatment system because of a toxic algal bloom that's set up in Lake Erie right over top of their intakes. So that toxic algal bloom, there was something like 400,000 people without water for a period of time because they couldn't treat, they didn't have the mechanisms to be able to treat that water. The toxic algae, or the algae produces toxins, saxitoxins, neurotoxins, powerful liver toxins. It's really not stuff you want to mess with. And also not just water supplies, but also contact with the water. So you can, there are multiple pathways that you can get these toxins into your body. One is obviously if you're swimming in it, absorption, ingestion, and then also these toxins can aerosolize, and people can breathe them in if you spend enough time on a waterway. They're toxic to pets, and especially people with compromised immune systems. Biggest rule of thumb at this point, Pennsylvania does not have a monitoring system in place at this point to monitor cyanobacteria like the state of Ohio does. At this point, use your head. If the water looks bad, don't go in. Your brain's telling you something that you shouldn't be in that water, you shouldn't be touching that water. It's not 100% reliable because not all algae is toxic. There's only certain types that are toxic. But as a rule of thumb, if the water looks really nasty, don't take a chance. It's just common sense, isn't it? But some of these algal blooms, some of these toxic algal blooms can happen without visible effects. So it is important to be able to be aware of what's out there. And filamentous and benthic mat algae. Give you kind of a side story with another invasive. Waterways that see zebra mussel infestations, a lot of times we'll see increase in benthic algae. And a lot of times what's happening is that the zebra mussels are clarifying the water. Pontiac Lake is seeing this right now in some areas on the margin. Water is clarified by zebra mussels. As the water is clarified, the nutrients are still available. There's a lot of phosphorus coming into Pontiac Lake, and the first thing that takes up that phosphorus is the benthic mat algae that's on the margins. And what you end up seeing is these huge mats of benthic mat algae. Lake Erie, we see this a lot with Cladophora and species like that, where eventually what happens is it dies off and it breaks free and floats up on people's beaches. And if you've ever seen dead algae or smelled dead algae, it smells like raw sewage washing up on your beach. So it's not something that you want to see happen. So muskgrass, Cara, this is a macroalga. It looks a lot like one of the higher plants, but this is an algae species. Again, this one has sort of a brittle feeling, a little bit harder feeling, and also if you crunch it up in your hands and you smell it, it stinks like some people say garlic, some people say skunk. So take your pick, whatever you'd rather it smell like. One that I'll roll into then is Starry stonewort. This is one that they're dealing with a lot in the Midwest at this point. This is an invasive species, an invasive macroalgae. Presque Isle has it right now. This one, again, forms those dense pillows of vegetation that crowds out your native vegetation. The interesting thing that this species in its native habitat is endangered. In the United States, it's becoming a fast-growing invasive species that's becoming a real nightmare to try to manage. So just something when you look at this on a global scale. The easiest way to identify this species is by that little star-shaped bulb that they produce. So if you find a plant that's causing you problems, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you see those little star-shaped structures that are on there. That's Starry stonewort. So aquatic plant management options. I've gone through native species and invasive species. Native species can cause problems in areas, especially use impairments. Generally, they're not a nuisance unless they're in front of your boat dock or they're around your launch area or something along those lines. Invasive species, I've gone through the litany of reasons why we don't want to see invasive species enter our waterways. So if they do enter, there are a number of different options that are out there. You may have seen the mechanical harvester on Pontiac Lake working its way through. Essentially, this is a sickle bar that's lowered down into the water, cuts the vegetation. Vegetation is removed. You get a twofold benefit from that. One is that you're maintaining the aquatic plants. Second is that you're removing the plant material itself. And in Pontiac Lake, that's important because Pontiac Lake is impaired for nutrients, meaning there's too much phosphorus within the lake. If you can remove that plant material, you can remove the phosphorus with it. So that's one of the reasons that they utilize that. The problem with mechanical harvesting, though, is that it fragments plants. And if you have a species like Hydrilla, once you fragment hydrilla, you end up spreading it. We've seen that on other lakes in Pennsylvania where they run through with a harvester and spread it everywhere. So the folks on Pontiac Lake are aware that if hydrilla shows up on Pontiac Lake, the harvester operation will likely end on Pontiac Lake. They're expensive to operate, expensive to run, and they're non-selective. So they cut everything. You can't be selective for invasive species versus native species. Biocontrols, we don't see a lot of use of biocontrols in this area. The one notable exception is purple loosestrife. There's a beetle from its native range that has been shown to be not invasive that they do use for control in Pennsylvania. Grass carp, we don't see this one a whole lot in the north either. In the southern reservoirs, where they don't have a whole lot of plant species to begin with, a lot of times they'll use grass carp. Again, grass carp are non-selective, so they eat everything. They have sort of a hierarchy on plants, but if you introduce grass carp into a waterway, you don't have control over what they're eating. So you're hoping they're eating, you don't have control where they eat either. So it's hard to control your plant population. If I haven't said it before, aquatic plants are important for the lake. They're important for food, they're important for structure and for fish habitat, for waterfowl food. So you want to have plants within the lake, but you want to have plants in a manageable structure. Grass carp also require a permit to be used in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So if you do want to use grass carp in say a private pond, you do have to go through a permitting process before you can utilize them. Chemical application is the most common treatment option for aquatic plants. You can be very selective with the type of treatment that you do, targeting specific species, targeting specific areas. The trade-off is that it can be costly in some cases. So those are some of your options that are out there. The best option, though, is really preventing it from happening in the first place. So being aware of what's in your lake or reservoir, whether it's native or invasive, and then also being aware when you're moving from waterway to waterway. So if you're fishing in one place, you're moving to another, or if you're kayaking in one location, you're moving to another, making sure that you clean your equipment and remove any visible plant fragments, flushing water, cleaning your equipment. Clean, drain, dry is the motto for moving boats from one waterway to another. Last thing you want to do is head out to Pymatuning, pick up hydrilla on your boat, bring it back to Tamarack when it's refilled, drop your boat on Tamarack, and then all of a sudden you've got a hydrilla infestation. So it's a cautionary tale to pay attention to what's around your lake, what's within the reservoir, and then also new things that do show up. If you do see a species of plant that you don't know what it is and you're curious about it, my contact information should be the next slide here. Feel free to contact me and ask questions. If I don't know the answer, I probably know somebody who does. So give me a call with your plant questions.
Are we going to have those signs up where the docks are?
Fishing boat has been putting the clean, drain, dry signs.
I wouldn't
each
have
one of the
known that.
lunches.
Like I kayak, and I wouldn't have known all that. I wouldn't have even thought about it, to be honest.
All of our state agencies right now have been really good. Game Commission, Fish and Boat, DCNR, about getting signs up at each one of their launch sites. So if you don't see a sign, each one of the agencies have said let them know because they'll get one up. So those signs were provided.
And that's typically our law enforcement folks that do the signage.
So I don't think that was there. This is
No,
probably
this-
all new stuff.
It is.
so I don't think-
Yeah, this really, within the last 5-6 years, those signs have popped up within the last probably 3 years on a lot of the waterways.
I
So
think a
it's,
lot of people just wouldn't even know.
yep, which is exactly why I'm
No.
doing these talks. Yeah, a lot of people don't know. A lot of this was innocent. If you notice that I mentioned the last time about launch stewards of Pymatuning, that's the reason that they're there is trying to make sure that folks aren't moving these species from one waterway to another. So we're going to hold most of our questions for now, and we'll get our next speaker up. Take just a minute to get readjusted here.
Thanks, Brian. Thank all of you for coming this evening. My it's Ben Page, Lake Habitat Section Chief for the PA Fish and Boat Commission. Our program, our habitat program, is statewide, so I'm based out of Center County, but we have spent quite a bit of time up here in Crawford County. We were just recently here at Woodcock Creek Lake, doing fish habitat there at that lake. But so we're involved with Tamarack Lake on the front end, and I believe we got a call a couple of years ago from the Friends of Tamarack Lake about how we could get involved with the fish habitat out there. And so tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about the proposed project we have there. To give you a little bit of background about our program, we serve the whole state, and a lot of our reservoirs look similar to this. This is, if you guys have been out to Woodcock and seen what the bottom of Woodcock Creek Lake looks like, it's very similar to this. This is a core lake that's drawn down 20 feet. There's not a whole lot of physical fish habitat there. Fortunately for folks that fish at Tamarack, there's actually quite a bit of stumps in there. So our first assessment, or looking at that, we knew that there was a decent amount of wood fish habitat in there. So that's how we got into this process and this talk about including vegetation as a management tool for fish habitat. Good. And so if those of you that are familiar with our program at Woodcock Creek Lake or Pine Tuning or even Sugar Lake, we have a long history since the 1980s of doing fish habitat. A lot of times we work with folks like Brian at the Conservation District, working with volunteers, Pine Tuning Lake Association, and we'll build these structures and we'll put them into reservoirs that typically don't have the stumps like Tamarack has. And then not only to benefit the fish, but also the anglers. I'll talk about that here. So it's important for fish to have physical fish habitat structure. So we know that obviously water quality is very important. From my knowledge and talking to our folks from fish management, I knew historically Tamarack Lake does have a very productive warm water fishery. So we know that the potential is there to bring that fishery back, and that's what we're working towards. But we can use fish habitat as a management tool as well. And so as you can see, there's several different reasons why those warm water fish typically relate to fish habitat at certain life stages and seasonally throughout the year. So all of our fish habitat that we've done all across the state, just for all those anglers in the crowd that may not be familiar, all of our habitat structures are all mapped. And this is all on our Fish and Boat Commission website. So if you're an angler out there and you want to find some of these locations, you can pull up these maps and it takes you right to the site with latitude and longitude with your GPS. It'll tell you the site depth and year that we put those structures in. Some of the structures that we put in are channel catfish spawning boxes, porcupine cribs, short vertical plank structures, that's more of an ambush cover, rock rubble reefs, shoreline with all these stone deflectors. We also do vertical cover. If you guys have seen standing timber, we'll put it in post clusters as well. Black bass nesting structures, turtle basking platforms. We're also responsible for the reptiles in Pennsylvania, so we also do turtle habitat. And one of our favorites is felled shoreline trees as well. We'll fell and cable trees. In the Tamarack Lake situation, we want to use another tool from the toolbox. So we're looking at aquatic vegetation. Brian touched on that and the importance of it in terms of fish habitat. And so not only is it good for fish habitat, beneficial for those populations, but also wildlife as well. And there is science behind the correlation with largemouth bass, which a lot of us warm water anglers like to target. So direct correlation being between adult populations and the amount of vegetation to a point. Okay, so certain amounts or acreage in your lake, it has a positive influence on the largemouth bass population. And so, looking at the Tamarack Lake project, using models from Texas where they've had successful projects doing aquatic vegetation management, and using hopefully some of the local school groups to get involved and to use some plants from herb seeds. We'll get into a little bit more details there, and do some plantings right on the lake bottom of Tamarack Lake. In this process, it's important to have exclusion fencing. So Brian touched on all the different wildlife and the fish that this can benefit. Well, if we don't put exclusion fencing up, we just opened up an all-you-can-eat salad bar for our wildlife and our fish. So it's important for these founder colonies, so to speak, to be fenced in. So you want to have that seed base there and protect the original plants that you're putting in there. So 4 species that we talked about: eelgrass, water willow, arrow arum, and pickerel weed. These are ones that Brian and I have talked with Greg from Earth Seeds. These are ones that will be capable of raising captivity, but also native species that we know, that are beneficial for the fish habitat and bat habitat. Brian, hopefully got the point across there as far as what we don't want is we definitely don't want the public to be, whether purposely or accidentally bringing in species like Hydrilla. He touched on it. Can't quite get that point across enough that it's pretty important, and we as Fish and Boat Commission employees have protocols and take it pretty seriously when we take our boats from one lake to the next to make sure this doesn't happen. But you can see what Brian was talking about with an entire cove. If you have a few patches of aquatic vegetation, you have good fish habitat. But if you end up with an entire cove that's just a complete mat of vegetation, obviously it's not good for fish habitat. It's not good for us as anglers or even as boaters and kayakers. So we want to avoid that. And so this is the plan map, and we're looking at 3 different sites. All right, so my idea with this project is to certainly start small and see how we do with our colonies of plants in these 3 different sites. We have 1 site on the northern end, and then 2 sites on the southern side. I do have a map over here on the side table if you guys are interested in looking at those sites. All right, so this is a little bit more of a close-up, and when we proposed these sites, we went around to each of the accesses, and one just so that we can get in and actually work with machinery and hand tools and everything, get into these sites. But I also made sure that we're keeping a good distance from the boat launches as well as shoreline access. We don't want to be putting exclusion fences right in front of where people cast or right in front of where boats are going to be launching. And so, get you up to speed with the project timeline. We sat down with Brian and I and Greg from Earth Seeds back in February to talk about what species we want to grow, how many, that sort of thing. And then tonight, very important to talk with you folks, get your feedback on the project, and hear what you have to say. And then coming up this May, we've been in contact with our Fish and Boat Commission maintenance folks, the folks that mow the grass. We want to get in there and clear some of the terrestrial stuff, and we're talking about a small area, maybe half the size of this room, just so that we can work in that area once it is flooded, that way we're not fighting with goldenrod or whatever other species that may be in that small area. And then we'd be looking at a proposed date in September where we'd be able to work with the school kids once they're back in class, and Earth Seeds has had all summer to raise those plants that we're proposing to plant in there. And then any project like this always needs follow-up, to take a look at what's growing, what didn't make it, to maintain exclusion fencing. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Who's paying for the project, and how much does it cost, and where is the water coming from that's going to fill the lake?
Fish and Boat Commission will be paying for the exclusion fencing, And Earned Seeds is donating the plants.
I mean, what is the rough cost? Is it obviously state funding? What is the rough cost for the complete project to fill the lake and to?
Haven't put the cost estimate together. It'll be under $1,000 for the fencing and the T-post, yeah.
Where does the water come from?
Right now, it's proposed for refill in April. As far as from the last meeting to this meeting, there isn't any news. I did check in with our Bureau of Engineering. So yeah, at this point, I think they're waiting for a refill permit from DEP.
It'll be naturally refilled by all the
Right,
rain and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's what
It'll take a while. And it depends on how long it gets prolonged too. The later we get into the early summer, you don't have as much rain during that time. It may take a while, but that's okay because there is a standard procedure of how long it takes to refill it. They want to, they want to do it at a very level where they can really gauge everything, make sure everything is sound. So. And when they do it, DEP usually pauses at certain stages to test the dam to make sure it's saturated properly and everything's functioning. So they might fill it partially, wait a while, and even though you have a good opportunity to put more water in, they'll let it go because they're still testing the dam to make sure it's functioning, and then they'll fill it some more. And so they've got a pretty strict timetable as to how they'll do that when they refill these lakes. And I think when Paul was here, he did mention you may see it drained and then filled back up. There are periods where they've got to do it to check all that out too. So don't be alarmed on that. If you say it was just filled up to this level, why did it go back down? That's all part of the process. It's a big lake in a small watershed, so it might take some time.
To further answer your question too, because we're working with Aquatic Vegetation, let's say for some strange reason we don't have water by September, we're not going to go out and plant plants without the appropriate water levels. We'll ask parents to hang on to those and possibly plant them at a later date.
Do you have a list of schools? Because I know there's schools that do that.
I actually count on Brian here. With our climate tuning project, I know typically Conneaut Lake Middle School has been involved. I know there's a couple of folks that.
We've been planting trees for almost 20 years now alongside of streams. This will be our first in the water lake part. We've done shoreline plantings at Climate Tuning Reservoir. We've never actually got our feet wet and gone into the water to do this, so we're pretty excited about it. We've got every school district in the county works with us, but yeah, if you got specific folks you'd like to work to, there's probably a teacher that we work with there.
Do you think the project will be far enough along that you'll be able to do it by the middle of the month, filling it?
As far
Refilling the lake, is that what you're talking about?
Right.
He's asking about refill.
Your schedule is the middle of the month, middle of April, right?
I'm not familiar with that.
That's what was mentioned at the last meeting that we had. But the construction crew and all that, and the contractor, I think I don't think we're at that date at this point. I'm not sure yet. I think they're still working with the contractor. They're not supposed to come back to start work until I believe next week is what was proposed, what was mentioned to me. April 1st is when they're going to come back and start working on it. There's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done. So
they're working today, working yesterday and today. Well, yesterday they were working. They're down there working there.
Okay. Yeah, we heard April 1st, so they must have just come back.
They got cement trucks or, a lot of equipment. They're putting dirt on this is the north end of the dam. They're putting dirt on the brick. There's cement brick that they have. Well, I guess they're made out of cement.
They're putting the topsoil over the top of that.
Topsoil, and then they'll seed it, I guess, right?
Right.
Yeah.
They've got the north end probably half done.
Right. But they still got to get to the south end, and they got to remove the coffer dam, and there's still some work that's got to be down at the other end. So before they finish up. So
I think Paul mentioned last time there's certain checkpoints that they have to meet for each one to go, and a lot of it's weather dependent. Kind of same with permits, and there's a lot of things that have to happen in a road. There's a lot of wiggle room in those dates, I think, is what he was trying to say at the last meeting.
We talked to the inspector one day, and He said they were coming back April 1st and they thought they had 3 months worth of work left. So it all depends on how fast they get done, what they have left to get done. And we still have to drain it and kill the carp.
I think you were working yesterday, if I remember right. And maybe the day before too.
I know with aquatic vegetation, there can be a die-off and a depletion of oxygen and subsequent fish kills because of that. Is that a concern with the weeds that are in there now? Because I know there's a lot of weeds and a lot of trees that have grown in that area. Is that a concern when we start restocking that there may be a possibility of fish kills? Or will that phase be done by the time we start?
We refilled about 5 or 6 lakes over the last couple of years, and all of them were really heavy with terrestrial vegetation. We haven't had any DO grabs because of that decomposition. Normally, you have to have very warm water, and it'll happen at night. And we haven't seen it with the terrestrial vegetation, and it's pretty rare even with the aquatic vegetation. You got to have a pretty specific set of circumstances for that to happen, and it's very rare that we have it happen in PA. And so we haven't seen it in any of our other lakes yet, so we don't expect it to be a problem.
There's a few small trees, maybe 10, 12 feet tall, or in that vicinity, but not a whole lot.
Well, you can share about
Well,
the one.
I would actually love to see more trees. They're really, really great habitat. Glade Run Lake is just taking off with fish because of all the trees we left in the lake when we refilled it. There's just some small patches in Tamarack. I would suggest we leave those too. They'll probably be fish magnets. They're really good feeding and spawning habitat. And depending on the species, they should last quite a few years. The goldenrod and the grass and stuff, that usually takes about at least a year for it to fully decompose. It lasts a lot longer than you think it would. And
And the black willows in Glade Run are still alive.
they're still alive and growing.
10 feet of water, some of them.
Yeah.
This is kind of off topic, but my dad was wondering, we live like right beside Tamarack Lake on South Wayland, but he used to have like a 10-foot John boat that he chained to a cable that they'd have down there, and then he gave the Game Commission like an annual fee, I guess, and you put it in at a certain date and take it out at a certain date. That way you didn't have to take your boat in and out of the water from different places. He was just wondering if you guys were going to bring that back.
Yeah, I don't work for law enforcement. I don't know if we still do
I mean,
that. I'm familiar with other lakes in Pennsylvania.
I think we still maintain mooring areas at a lot of our Fish Commission lakes, and it's basically concrete pylons with a steel pipe in between, and you chain your boat to that and can leave it there. And every year you apply for it and get a mooring permit. I think we still use it. It's not nearly as popular as it used to be.
We have in Kyle Lake.
Yeah.
Kyle Lake is one that we have a area there and chain up and all that.
Is the structure still there that you used to?
I believe it is.
I wouldn't see why that wouldn't change. That should be just same as it always was.
We can get clarification from that, from law enforcement and all that. That's going to
Yeah, and then if I can get your email address or something like that, we'll follow up.
We would actually promote that as well too, just from keeping boats coming in and out all the time from all the other places. If you have one boat there that people fish that water, then it's less likely to get a lot of these invaders coming in.
Yeah,
so.
because you can pick up a 10-foot John boat for like $300 nowadays.
Yeah.
So you just buy that, stick it on the lake,
Yeah.
so you didn't have to do nothing.
I mean, it's biosecurity aspect. It's something that's good.
When it gets filled in fishing, your concern is somewhat, I guess, about people putting the wrong kind of fish in there. Come in. If we're over there someday and we see somebody coming in with a lot of grass in their boat, or stuff from someplace else, should we say something about it to them, or?
Oh yeah.
Or-
Yeah,
Will they
the
drown?
consequences are too dire to not ask them to clean their boat.
Right.
It seems like each successive invasive species is worse than the last one. You know, milfoil you could still fish around, you could fish in it. It was actually semi-decent fish habitat. Hydrilla is just horrible. You can't boat through it, you can't fish in it, you can't do anything with it. And so yeah, you really, the best way to do it is to keep it from ever showing up, because once it's there, it's a nightmare.
You can point them to the signs that are going to be that are posted there too, saying, you know, this is an important thing. We want to preserve what we have, especially a new lake coming on board. That's the worst thing. That's our worst fear, is to start right out with something that's not supposed to be there. Obviously, Hydrilla or Eurasian milfoil or anything else, any other invasives, it's extremely important. The lake is very vulnerable at that early time like that, so absolutely.
I know you had said something at the last meeting about having washing stations. That's still
Okay,
something?
so at Pine Tuning, there were a couple different things that we've done in Pine Tuning over the years. And DCNR used it as a pilot project. It seems like it's stuck now at Pine Tuning. This will be the 4th year, I believe. But one is the launch steward, so actually having a physical presence of a steward there to inspect the boat and ask people to remove stuff from it if they see it. Second phase of that was with an Eagle Scout. We built invasive species disposal stations, and they were essentially a square box with gravel on the bottom. There's signage that's associated with it. The idea is that you pull your boat up, you've got something hanging on it, or if you pull it out of Pine Tuning, you've got something on it. You pull that off, dispose of it in that disposal station. It's contained, it desiccates, and it dies. Like I said last time at the last meeting that you were referencing, people are using it for bait disposal as well, which is another thing that we like to see. We don't want to see you moving bait from waterway to waterway. They're disposing of it in those disposal stations. So that was an Eagle Scout project, and that's definitely a potential for for Tamarack. There's funding that's available to be able to do that, to request, and it was an Eagle Scout, and then the Bass Club that he belonged to actually came in, built them, and installed them. And I think they installed 16 of them around Pine Tuning Reservoir. Wash stations, Pine Tuning, they have one installed at the Espyville Marina. They have 2 more that are supposed to go in at Jamestown and Linesville facilities. And essentially, it's a power washer station that's in a dedicated spot. The idea is you pull your boat up, boat and trailer up to it, and you can wash it physically right there on site. So when you're pulling your boat out, clean it, or before you come in, same thing, pressure wash it, make sure you don't have any plant fragments. One thing about these plant fragments, a piece of hydrilla that big that's on your trailer, around your bunks or somewhere else that ends up in the water, it has a chance of sprouting and starting an infestation. So it's not like you've got to have this big wad of plants hanging off your boat to start an infestation. You can start off a single fragment. Even partially desiccated or partially dried out plant fragments can rehydrate and have a small percentage of a chance to reestablish themselves and grow. So even though it's dry, it still has a potential to take off. So it's that serious.
We have a lot of knotweed out there, and the only thing that likes it are the bees, right?
Yeah.
And we do have some stripe out there too.
Yeah, there probably is some purple loosestrife. I know there's Phragmites, and then I hadn't seen the Japanese knotweed, but I wouldn't doubt it.
A lot of
There's
it.
a lot down our way.
Yeah. So those are species that are concerned. There's no effective state program at this point to pay for the treatment of invasive species. So that's one of the hangups in Pennsylvania right now, is that we just don't have an effective means of being able to respond to invasives. And then when you get into knotweed and Phragmites, which are pretty broad and widespread, the chance for funding is even more slim. So a lot of times species like that will get a local effort that will try to leverage funding one way or another to be able to address that. But yeah, Phragmites is one that concerns me around the lake itself, because it's within the basin. When it refills, those seeds are probably going to disperse on the outside edges of it. You probably see stands of Phragmites popping up.
Looks like when they trim the roadside, they like they're reseeding almost.
Yeah, well,
Right.
the Japanese knotweed, when you
Yeah.
fragment it, and those fragments all have a chance of if they're in contact with soil, they can resprout and regrow. It's really tough stuff to get rid of once you get it established.
The deer hide in it.
Yeah.
We had quite a pathway. We watched 10, 11 deer go across the lake back and forth. You could see the trails everywhere and watch them go.
I can imagine.
So they're going to be in for a surprise, aren't they?
Yeah.
We have seen them swim across before, but
Yeah. Yeah, this year deer
there's
season,
a
they
lot
won't
of
have a place to
them.
hide.
Hmm?
This year deer season, they won't have a good place to hide, that's for sure.
And the bear, too.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. That was very informative.